They were just two quiet girls in worn-out shoes, stepping into a world of marble floors and million-dollar minds. But when the most feared teacher tried to put them in their place, they didn't just fight back. They solved the problem no one else could, with a method no one had ever seen before. What happened next shook the entire school to its core and changed everything. If you are new to the channel, then please subscribe to the channel and like the video and tell us where are you watching from. Now let's jump into the story. The sun rose slowly over the quiet rooftops of Elmsworth, casting a soft golden glow on the cracked sidewalks and rustling trees. In a small brick apartment tucked between a laundromat and a bakery, two young girls stood side by side in their tiny hallway. Mila Greenfield adjusted the straps of her backpack for the fourth time, biting her lip as her reflection stared back from the mirror. Her twin sister, Nora, hugged a weathered math notebook to her chest, her fingers brushing over the corner where a faded photo was taped. It was their mother, smiling wide in a bright scarf, holding them both as babies. The photo was old now, but the warmth in it never faded. Gregor Greenfield, their father, stood behind them in his janitor's coat. Worn from years of night shifts, he looked at his daughters with quiet pride, his eyes tired but shining. Today was their first day at Maplebridge Institute, the most prestigious school in the city. It stood high on the hill, built of stone and old money, and it had never seen students like Mila and Nora, not from their side of town, not in second-hand shoes and clearance sale uniforms. "Remember what your mom used to say," Gregor whispered, kneeling between them. "It's not where you come from, it's how far you're willing to go." Mila gave a small nod. Nora squeezed his hand, and together they stepped out into the crisp fall air. The bus ride was quiet, except for the gentle hum of engines and the occasional chatter of students in polished shoes. Mila stared out the window, her thoughts swimming with nerves and questions. Would the others laugh at them? Would they know the twins didn't belong? As the bus crested the hill, Maplebridge came into view. It looked like a castle, with tall archways, perfectly trimmed hedges, and fountains that sparkled like diamonds. Nora leaned toward the glass, her eyes wide. "It looks like a museum," she whispered. "Or a dream," Mila added softly. Gregor squeezed their hands one last time as they stepped off the bus. "You belong here," he reminded them. "Don't let anyone make you feel different." They entered through heavy wooden doors into a wide marble hallway that smelled faintly of lavender and floor wax. Lockers shone like silver. Portraits of past headmasters lined the walls, all in suits with eyes that followed them as they walked. The girls clutched their schedule, their names printed neatly at the top. Below it read, "Advanced Mathematics, Room 3C, Mrs. Vale." Their introduction began in the front office, where Principal Harrow greeted them with a smile too sharp to feel warm. He was tall, with slicked-back hair and shoes that clicked loudly on the tile. "Ah, the Greenfield twins," he said, as if reading a menu he didn't quite approve of. "Yes, from the scholarship program." Gregor extended a hand politely, but Harrow barely touched it, his attention already drifting toward a parent nearby dressed in designer brands. The principal led the girls down a long corridor, his voice echoing. "You'll be in our advanced class," he said. "We like to give every student a chance, no matter their background." Mila caught Nora's eye, and they both knew what he meant. Their fingers brushed and held, like they always did when things felt hard outside the classroom. Principal Harrow paused. "Mrs. Vale is one of our finest," he said. "She has high standards. I hope you're ready." He turned away with a nod, leaving them in front of a wooden door with a brass plaque that read, "Advanced Mathematics." Inside, students were already seated, notebooks open, pencils clicking. The air was thick with quiet competition, as if everyone was trying to be the best without saying a word. Vale stood at the front, writing numbers on the board with perfect angled strokes. She was tall and elegant, with a gray streak in her hair, It seemed to match the coldness in her eyes. When the twins entered, she turned, her gaze cool and calculating. "Everyone, we have 2 new students today," she said. "Mila and Nora Greenfield, from special admission." The pause in her sentence didn't go unnoticed as the girls took 2 empty seats near the back. Whispers floated around them. Names were exchanged behind cupped hands. A few students stared openly. A boy in a navy blazer raised an eyebrow as if they were from another planet. Mila sat tall, her back straight, but her heart pounded in her chest. Nora unfolded her notebook and placed it neatly on the desk, her hands shaking just a little. Vale turned back to the board. "Today, we begin with number sequences," she said, "something that challenges even the best minds." Mila looked at the numbers, already spotting a pattern. Nora began sketching quietly in the margins of awe. Her notebook, their mother had taught them these before, not with fancy textbooks or whiteboards, but at their kitchen table, using dry pasta and colored buttons. Solving problems felt like a game back then, a puzzle waiting to be unlocked. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows. The classroom buzzed with quiet energy, but no one noticed the way Mila and Nora leaned slightly toward each other, already thinking, already solving, already preparing to change everything. The second day at Maplebridge began with frost on the yawl, windows and a quiet promise in the air. Mila and Nora Greenfield walked side by side through the school gates, their breath forming small clouds as they stepped into the warmth of the marble corridors. They held their notebooks close, their backpacks heavier with expectation than books. The whispers from yesterday had not faded. If anything, they had grown louder, but so had something inside the twins, something that sounded a lot like courage-umers. Vale's classroom looked just the same as the day before. Polished desks, straight-backed chairs, and sunlight pouring through tall windows that made everything look golden. But there was a new kind of tension in the room, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Mila and Nora took their seats quietly, their pencils already in hand, ready to face whatever the day might bring. As the bell rang, Mrs. Vale strode into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her hair perfectly tied back, her voice smooth and sharp like polished glass. "Today," she said, "we continue with complex number patterns." She wrote a long equation on the board, numbers and symbols dancing in a line across the smooth surface. "This is a challenge from last year's Math Olympiad," she added, glancing around the room. "Let's see who's brave enough to try it." The room fell silent. Students shifted in their seats. Some looked down. Others pretended to reread their notes. Mrs. Vale scanned the room, and then, without warning, her eyes landed on Mila. "Miss Greenfield," she said, her tone sweet but laced with challenge. "Would you care to give it a try?" Mila's heart thudded in her chest. For a second she couldn't move, but then she felt Nora's gentle nudge under the desk, the same quiet signal they'd used since kindergarten. Mila stood slowly, the room echoing with the scrape of her chair. She walked to the board with her chin lifted just a little higher than yesterday. She took the chalk in her hand, its surface dry and familiar, and began to think, really think. Her mind breaking the problem into smaller pieces. Her mother used to say math was like baking. Follow the right steps and the recipe always works. Mila followed the recipe, step by step, her handwriting small but sure. And as she neared the end of the problem, a soft whisper rose from the back of the room. "Wait, she's actually doing it." When she finished, she turned to face the class, her hands slightly dusty from the chalk. "The trick," she said, her voice a little stronger now, "is to simplify the pattern first, then work backwards." Mrs. Vale looked at the board, her eyes narrowing just slightly. Then she gave a nod so small it was almost invisible. "Reasonable effort," she said, but her tone didn't match her words. Mila walked back to her seat, her cheeks burning, but her eyes bright. Nora reached over and squeezed her hand under the desk. A quiet "you did it," in the language only they knew, but The lesson wasn't over yet. Mrs. Vale turned and began writing again. This time a geometry puzzle with lines and angles drawn in precise strokes. Now something visual, she said. Let's see if your sister is equally brave. Nora stood before Mila could even look at her. She walked to the board with the same grace she used when drawing at home. The lines didn't scare her. They spoke to her, like shapes waiting to become stories. She pulled a piece of chalk and began sketching beside the problem, turning angles into boxes, lines into ladders, slowly building a picture that made sense even without numbers. The room grew still. Students leaning forward, even Mrs. Vale stopped writing, watching Nora's diagrams fill the board. The key, Nora said gently, is to break it into smaller shapes. Then you can measure the space by comparing the pieces. She stepped back, her drawing both clear and clever, a mix of art and math that made even the quietest students nod in understanding. Gone student, a girl named Talia, whispered to the boy next to her, I think I actually get it now. Across the hallway, Mr. Arlo Fitch, the science teacher, passed by the door and paused. Something about the twin at the board caught his attention. He stepped closer, watching silently, his eyes moving from the shapes on the board to the curious faces of the students. When the bell rang, the class didn't scatter like usual. Instead, a few students lingered near the twins. One boy asked Mala if she could help him understand part of the problem later. Another girl asked Nora how she figured out where to draw the shapes. The classroom that had once felt cold now felt different, lighter, warmer. Mrs. Vale sat behind her desk, her eyes flicking between the twins and the cluster of students around them. She said nothing, but her fingers tapped the desk in quiet rhythm. Across the room, Mr. Fitch leaned on the doorway, a thoughtful smile playing at the corner of his mouth as the twins packed their bags. Talia came over with a hesitant smile. I used to hate math, she said softly, but the way you explained it, it made sense. Mila blinked, surprised, then smiled back. It makes more sense when you look at it together, Nora added, and Talia nodded outside. The wind picked up and scattered leaves across the schoolyard. But inside the classroom, something small had changed, something important. It wasn't just about solving numbers anymore. It was about being seen, being heard, and maybe, just maybe, being understood. The days at Maplebridge began to move faster. Autumn deepened, and the leaves turned to fire and gold outside the classroom windows. Inside room 3C, Mila and Nora Greenfield had become more than just new faces. They had become a quiet mystery. Classmates who once whispered now watched with growing curiosity. Teachers who once doubted now lingered a little longer when the girls worked at the board. And even the air in Mrs. Vale's room felt different. Like the start of something, no one could name her. Arlo Fitch, the science teacher who often passed by the math class, had begun staying behind after his lessons ended, sometimes borrowing chalk he didn't need, sometimes asking Mala small questions that tested not just her answers, but the way she thought. He noticed how she broke problems down like a puzzle, and how Nora could turn a question into a shape and see solutions others missed. These girls, he said one afternoon to Miss Dina Loren, the art teacher, they're seeing things most students can't. Miss Lorraine was curious. She had seen Nora sketching geometric patterns during recess and asked to see her notebook. She was stunned by the clean lines and detailed designs. This isn't doodling, she whispered. This is a new way of thinking. She invited Nora to stay after class one day and introduced her to the connections between art and math, proportions in paintings, balance in sculpture. Suddenly, Nora began to see math in the world around her, not just in books, but in light and shadows and shapes. But not everyone was impressed. Behind closed doors, Mrs. Vale had been speaking quietly with Principal Harrow about an upcoming event. The National Young Minds Mathematics Challenge, she said, placing a folder neatly on his desk. This could be the perfect stage to test our best student. Principal Harrow glanced at the name on the top of the registration form. Jamie. Tyner, he said. Of course. Jamie was from a family that donated to the school's library. Coached by private tutors since she was 5, her success had always been expected still. Mrs. Vale hesitated. I'd like to enter the green field. Twins as well, she added. It would be useful to see how far ... Natural talent can go. The words hung heavy in the air. Spoken like a challenge wrapped in curiosity. Harrow raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Deep down, he liked the idea of a clear comparison. He approved the request with a short nod. And the game quietly began. Mila and Nora were told the news the following Monday. You've been chosen to represent Maplebridge at the National Challenge, Mrs. Vale said, her voice unreadable. You'll be competing against top students from across the state, including those with years of specialized training. She handed them a packet thick with practice problems, her tone calm but her eyes sharp. I hope you're prepared. That night at home, Gregor Greenfield stood silently at the kitchen counter, holding the packet in his hands. It looked like another language, strange symbols and long paragraphs. He had finished school at 16 and hadn't looked at math since, but he saw the look in his daughter's eyes and knew he had to help somehow. He cleared the dinner table and pulled out a pad of paper. Let's take this one step at a time, he said, his voice steady. We'll figure it out together. The twins began. Studying every evening, Mila worked through logic and formulas. Using color-coded sticky notes to break down long problems, Nora mapped out diagrams, turning algebra into pictures and finding new ways to look at old equations. Gregor stayed with them through every late night. Even when he didn't understand the math, he made hot tea, found extra pencils, and cheered them on with every small breakthrough. On rainy afternoon, Mr. Fitch approached them after class, lowering his voice as he handed them an envelope. Someone left these old Olympiad papers in the lab years ago, he said with a wink. Might be interesting reading. Inside were pages of past competition problems, complete with notes and solution strategies. It was like finding treasure in plain sight. They studied those papers like explorers reading maps. There were setbacks, problems they couldn't solve. Pages filled with crossed-out answers and frustrated sighs. One night Nora broke down in tears, her head resting on the kitchen table. I'm not smart enough for this, she whispered. Those other kids have been preparing forever. Mila reached out and placed her hand over her sister's. Maybe they have, she said softly, but we have each other, and that counts for something that weekend. Gregor brought down a dusty box from the closet. Inside were their mother's old notebooks, filled with curved handwriting and little hearts drawn in the margins. She started writing these when she was in college, he said, placing one. Open in front of them, one page read. Math doesn't always look like numbers. Sometimes it's a feeling you can't explain until it clicks. Those words stayed with them. They began to study, not just to get the right answers, but to understand the way the problems worked. Mila would tackle a challenge from one side, and Nora from another. Then they'd switch notebooks and try. Again, slowly, they became a team that thought in two voices, solving as only as the competition day approached. Miss Lorraine added something new to their routine. She showed Nora how math and art connected through symmetry and design, how ancient architecture was built on ratios and angles. This gave Nora new confidence. She no longer saw math as a wall, but as a window. The night before the challenge, their living room was filled with papers, snacks, and quiet determination. Gregor watched them with pride that couldn't be measured. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said, you've already done more than anyone expected. Nora looked up and smiled. We're not doing this to prove something to them, she said. We're doing it to prove something to ourselves. The next morning, the Greenfield twins packed their bags, put on their pressed uniforms, and stepped out into the gray light of early dawn. The city was quiet, but inside their hearts, something strong was rising, something unseen but unshakable. They weren't just walking into a competition. They were walking into the chance to show the world what two unseen minds could become. The morning air was crisp and cold as the Greenfield family stood outside the tall stone building of Briar Hall Academy. Mila and Nora adjusted their scarves as their breath curled in the chilly sky. Beside them, Gregor Greenfield held their backpacks with quiet hands, his night shift badge still clipped to his coat. He looked up at the ivy-covered towers that stretched into the clouds and whispered, "Remember, you belong here." The twins nodded, their hearts pounding not from fear, but from everything they had prepared for inside the grand hall. Rows of desks were lined beneath arched ceilings. Hundreds of students filled the room, some dressed in suits, others in custom blazers. Tutors hovered at the edges, giving last-minute advice. Parents checked calculators and offered soft encouragement. Mila and Nora sat quietly near the center, unnoticed by most, their second-hand uniforms slightly faded, their notebooks worn from use. But their eyes held something rare, something steady. Principal Harrow and Mrs. Vale stood near the back, speaking with a judge in a tailored coat. Jamie Tyner stood nearby, her shoulders square, her eyes sharp, her confidence unshaken. She was the student Maplebridge had groomed for this very day, but she was not alone. And something about the quiet calm of the Greenfield twins unsettled her in a way she didn't fully understand us. The opening speech began. The room hushed. A woman with silver glasses stepped to the podium. "Welcome to the National Young Minds Mathematics Challenge," she said. "Today, we will test not just knowledge, but creativity, problem-solving, and endurance." The rules were simple. 5 rounds, each harder than the last. Only the top 5 would make it to the final stage. Round 1 began with rustling papers and focused silence. Mila and Nora flipped through the problems, solving with careful strokes. Mila worked through logic like unraveling thread, while Nora drew diagrams that made numbers make sense. 1 hour passed, then 2. By the end of round 3, many names had vanished from the board, but the twins remained, their scores quietly climbing during the lunch break. Students sat in groups, eating catered meals and talking about the challenge. The Greenfields sat at a small table near the back, eating sandwiches Gregor had packed that morning. "You're doing amazing," he said, watching them with proud eyes. Nora smiled. "We're just doing what Mom taught us." Mila nodded. "Think before you panic. Breathe before you guess." As round 4 ended, only 5 students remained. Jamie Tyner, a boy from Caldwell Prep, a girl from Wexford Heights, and the 2 Greenfield sisters. The judges announced a short break before the final challenge. Mrs. Vale stood by the window, her arms crossed, watching Jamie with narrowed eyes. Mr. Fitch quietly entered the room and gave Mila a small nod from the hallway. Miss Lorraine sat beside Gregor in the parent section, her hands folded tight. When the final round was announced, the room grew still. The last problem was revealed on a large board. It looked simple at first glance, a string of numbers, a pattern to continue, but it wasn't ordinary. It was layered, complex, hidden beneath rules no one could see on the surface. Calculators clicked, pencils flew. Jamie attacked the problem with formulas and theories. The boy from Caldwell tried equations he'd memorized. The girl from Wexford scribbled fast then. Erased everything. Mila and Nora didn't rush. They looked at the numbers, then at each other. They had seen this kind of thing before, not the exact problem, but the kind that wasn't about speed, but about seeing. Mila whispered. "Odd and even positions follow different rules," Nora added, "and the numbers form shapes, like staircases." They didn't speak again, just wrote, line by line. Mila broke the sequence down with analysis. Nora drew it as a spiral, both arriving at the answer in different ways that led to the same truth. Judges moved through the room, pausing at the twins' desks, reading their papers, whispering among themselves, heads nodding slowly, then faster. Time was called. Pencils. dropped, Jamie looked up, her paper half filled, her eyes uncertain. The judges collected the work, and silence fell once more. The results were announced, not with fanfare, but with quiet respect. "We have a winner," the lead judge said. "The team that not only solved the final problem, but presented two completely different, equally brilliant methods." She paused, looking toward the center row. Mila and Nora Greenfield of Maplebridge Institute. The room was silent for a moment, then filled with soft applause. Not the loud kind meant to impress, but the kind that comes from deep admiration. The girls stood, unsure at first, then walked forward together, their hands brushing just for a second. Principal Harrow clapped slowly. Mrs. Vale looked away, her mouth tight, but Mr. Fitch and Miss Lorraine smiled wide. Gregor stood with tears in his eyes, clapping with both hands, as if his heart were in each motion. They received their award, a scholarship offer, a trophy carved like a tree with numbers on its leaves, and something more, an invitation to publish their methods in a national education journal. The judges called it a new way of seeing math. One judge said softly, "You didn't just solve the problem. You taught us something about how children learn." On the way home, the girls sat quietly in the back seat of their father's car, the trophy resting between them. Outside, the sky turned pink with evening light. Nora looked at her sister. "Do you think Mom would be proud?" Mila nodded. "I think she already was." Gregor glanced at them in the mirror. "She used to say math was a way of listening to the universe," he said. "Today I think the universe finally heard you both." The next morning at Maplebridge, the halls were filled with curious eyes and softer voices. Classmates smiled at the twins, some even asked for help. Mrs. Vale stood at the front of the room, and when the girls entered, she gave them a small nod. "Welcome back," she said, and it almost sounded like respect. 2 weeks later, Principal Harrow announced a new program, the Denley Initiative, named after the twins' mother, designed to help students from all backgrounds discover their own brilliance. A bronze plaque was placed near the school entrance, engraved with a message that read, "For those who think differently and make the world better because of it." Mila and Nora walked past that plaque every morning, not for pride, but for memory, not to be noticed, but to remember how far they had come, and to remind themselves that sometimes the loudest voices come from those who choose to stay silent, listen deeply, and solve with heart.